Well, Dr. McGrath, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your participation in our Refuel Conference 2023. The Refuel Conference is sort of pitched towards church pastors who are engaged in local ministry in their parish and are trying to figure out, in particular, how to interact with doubts that their parishioners have, how to interact with the cross pressures they're experiencing in the late modern age. And as you've been thinking through your participation in the conference and apologetics in our current age, what would you say to the question one might ask, why does apologetics matter for your local small to medium-sized church pastor who's just trying to get through his weekly ministry and care well for the people in his congregation?
Well, first of all, let me say how delighted I am to be part of this conference. It's really exciting. Thank you very much for this privilege. I
Absolutely.
think the first point to make really is very simple, and that is that really the local church is the primary site for good apologetics.
Amen.
What I mean by that is people come to church to worship, but they also come with questions. They come with their own questions, things they're not quite sure about. Maybe they've come to faith with unresolved questions, or maybe they're questions about their friends who very often will ask them questions about, why do you Christians believe this?
Hmm.
And they are looking for answers to their own questions or their friends' answers. And they're looking for answers from someone who knows them. I think
Hmm.
that's a really important point, because the great thing about a local church is the pastor knows the congregation.
Hmm.
He knows the levels of engagement, the kind of ways of speaking that are going to connect up with that audience. And maybe that won't work somewhere else, but it's going to work for that local church. And that's why the local pastor is so important. Sure, great big national apologetics conferences are great, but what really matters is regular Sunday by Sunday engagement with questions which people are really asking. And
Hmm.
that's why pastors play such an important role, because you can work into your sermons apologetic themes, like say, some people say, well,
Hmm.
Richard Dawkins says that, religion doesn't make sense. Well, we can meet that. Let me tell you some of the things you can say. You
Hmm.
can resource people without having to lecture to them. And of course, you can also lay on local study days in your church if you want to. But what I want to say is apologetics is a science and an art.
Hmm.
And the local church allows you to develop the art of apologetics. In other words, taking these great riches from people who you've been reading about, like C.S. Lewis and all these people like Tim Keller,
Hmm.
and then you can do things with this in your church. And
Hmm.
I think that's what this conference is really going to help you to do, to say, it's about empowering you as an everyday pastor to see how you can do great things in and through and for your congregation.
Seems to me to carry with it this reality that the the local church ministry is able to do something that these big apologetics conferences, even through the internet where we have it beamed onto our computers and our phones every single day, isn't able to do. And at least part of what I heard you say is that the local church pastor is able to connect with the heart in a way uh, that is incarnational and engaged and knows his people. And there's a knowing involved in the local church and in the body of Christ being sort of connected as a community that doesn't exist when you only beam in the information for your mind from these large conferences, or if you only provide material for your congregation. There seems to be something important about the pastor's role as shepherd through seasons of doubt and through these sort of questions that people are having.
I think that's a very important point, and I think it's well worth developing this, because the kind of apologetics we're really talking about in a local church is relational. It's about, in effect, I know these people. I want to help them. I can figure out how to do it because I've worked with them. I know the language they speak. I know the concerns they have, and I want to be able to walk with them as they journey through these difficulties and try and
Hmm.
give them ways of thinking about or ways of seeing things which will really help them cope with this. And it's not as if I'm just saying, hey, read this book and go away. Don't bother me anymore. It's much rather, no, here's what I found helpful. Here's what I think I can help you to do in the season of doubt or difficulty. And it's very much about, in effect, a congregation meeting Sunday by Sunday, providing
Hmm.
Sunday by Sunday support to people, rather than the kind of one-off thing you find in the big international
Yes.
apologetics conference. So I really must emphasize this point. the individual church, the local church, your church, is critically important.
Amen.
It supplements what else is going on elsewhere, but it's necessary, it's important, and you have this vital role to play. So that's why I so welcome this conference, because it's doing this vitally important job.
Amen. And so, for the local pastor who feels what you're saying and deeply believes that their job is in their local congregation to shepherd their people through seasons of doubt, what would you say as they're trying to prepare and think through what it would look like to be ready to answer these questions? What are some of the pressing apologetic issues that they should pay attention to and attend to as they begin to reflect on what their congregation may ask them or may begin to experience as they go through life?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And let me just begin to tease out some of the things that we might think about here. One of the things I would suggest to pastors, you think about the difficulties you've experienced and what you have found helpful in dealing with these, partly because this may help a congregation, but also because, in effect, you're saying, look, I've been through these seasons of doubts. I've had to cope with these, and I found these helpful. And you're really sending out two very powerful messages. One is, look, I've been there too. I understand. I can help. And then here are these approaches that you may find helpful as well. So I think it's really important for pastors to feel that they can own up to any difficulties they've had and explain how they've been able to do with these. It makes them much more human, much more approachable. But there are questions that people are asking. Let me just mention two. One of them, I think, is a difficulty we found here in the United Kingdom, and I know you're finding this in the United States as well. And we might loosely use the word deconstruction.
Yes.
It's a technical word. What I mean by that is something like this. I mean, people who kind of way have come to church for a long time and kind of way ended up wondering, well, what exactly is my faith all about? You know, I'm not really sure anymore. They need help to reconnect with God, to revitalize their faith. And in effect, you know, this conference title is Refuel, maybe refresh, but there's a lot you can say to really help people get back on track. That's a concern I know many people have. But for a lot of people, it'll just be meeting the ordinary, everyday questions that they are asked in the shopping mall or in the, you know, a club somewhere or in, you know, wherever it is that people will say to them, hey, look, you're a Christian, you guys go to church. I've often wondered, you know, how on earth does believing in God make any difference to anything? And it's that kind of thing. What you need to be able to do is encourage your congregants to, in effect, think themselves into the perspective of people who are thinking about faith and ask, how can we help people move on to the next step? It doesn't mean answering all of their questions. It means giving them something to take away, which means they might come back and say, hey, I'd like to talk more about that. It's in fact trying to help people to see how they could make a difference to ordinary people, in encourage them and to explore this this engagement with faith and see where it takes them. So there's a huge amount that pastors can do, and you need to encourage your congregations. There's a lot they can do as well.
As I hear you share this reflection of pastors being honest and open, but also being able to engage in the everyday pressures that their congregants are feeling, both with their sort of what we might call academic questions, as well as their personal everyday questions. I wonder if in the American space, we've done this thing over the past 100 years where we've outsourced apologetics to the academy, and we've pushed apologetics off into the lecture halls and spaces where those professional sort of Christian thinkers can answer questions. And I wonder if part of this has made it to where doing this sort of incarnational, everyday pub apologetics, as you've called it, is not intuitive for pastors today. They feel as if that's a ministry for someone else, someone who knows what they're talking about, as it were, who's studied this. What would you say to a pastor who just feels intellectually unprepared to help their congregant who's dealing with deconstruction or dealing with the problem of evil? How would you encourage them to go about preparing?
I think what I would say to you is this, that you may well find your congregants are reading books or watching videos, and that's one source of reflection. But vitally important is what you provide with, what you as a pastor provide, because you can speak at the level of the heart. And what worries me is that as I look at many of these books that are written, or indeed one of these conferences or these videos that are being prepared, they very often are working at an academic, intellectual level. And that's great, but that's not where everyone is. In fact,
Yeah.
it's only where a few people are. And what we've really got to do is take Pascal very, very seriously. He talks about the heart having reasons that reason doesn't really know about, the heart having its reason. In other words, it's about love, it's about relationality, it's about hope, it's all these things. And I want to say you don't really get those themes talked about at all in these apologetics conferences, but you can talk about them. You can talk about how Christianity brings this relational integrity. You can talk about how it, in effect, gives you a vision of life, how it can keep you going, how, in effect, it speaks to your heart, not simply your head. And I think it's really important to say that apologetics works in many ways and at many levels. And that means there's a role for everyone somewhere in this enterprise. And what I want to say to pastors listening is, look, find your level, find your place. There's somewhere where you need to be, and you can do something decisive. So it's a question of how you find that place. And almost certainly it's going to be your church where you can do something really special. And what you've got to figure out is what is and how you do it.
Yes. It gets me excited every time I hear someone talk about Pascal, the logic of the heart. And even in this discussion about pastors being able to reflect on the way they love their congregants, the way they display compassion and care, and in the way they walk alongside their congregants in suffering, being a real apologetic that speaks to the heart, and that there is a sense in which they're able to do that. And you mentioned how a lot of times apologetics conferences aren't able to discuss that. And so I guess my next question for you is, for your session that you're preparing for this apologetics conference, what is it that you plan on talking about? What is it that you plan on sharing with the pastors, and what do you hope they walk away with?
What I'm going to share is how I, as an atheist, became a Christian and then discovered I could do apologetics. And I'm going to say to everyone listening to me, you can as well. I tell you about what I found. I'm going to talk about big picture apologetics. In other words, how Christianity gives us this wonderful, rich, big picture of reality, which speaks to the mind and the heart and the imagination, and which, doesn't just answer academic questions. It gives us a vision, an excitement about life that enables us to go out there and talk about the way in which Christianity transforms people. I talk about how we deal with doubt. I talk about how we build up hope. I also talk about how we find our own distinct calling as an apologist. So there's a lot of things I want to do, and the key thing I hope to do is to encourage you, to really say you can do something wonderful, because remember, apologetics is not about intellectual engagement. It's rather about allowing God to use you to help others to discover their gifts and use them. We must never leave God out of apologetics. We depend on divine grace right from the word go. And I don't see many apologetics textbooks talking about the importance of grace in apologetics. So what I hope to do really is just excite you, to encourage you, and to make you go away saying, hey, we can do something. This is great. So if you feel that after my talk, I'll be a very happy man.
Good. That excites me. I feel like apologetics too often misses the need to put mass into our arguments, human mass, the kind of mass that moves a person, not just in their minds, but actually moves their heart and shifts what they feel about life as well, that shows them a picture of grace and hope, which is what the gospel gives us and is what local pastors are already so good and in tune to doing for their congregants. They want to love them and care for them. And I think equipping them to know that those sort of moves in their congregation are apologetics. That is how they're shepherding their people through doubt. I'm excited to hear your talk, and I know many of the pastors who are attending are as well. Last question, and I know many of the pastors will be curious about this. If you had someone in your local church who was going through a season of doubt, and maybe it wasn't even a very articulate doubt, they just were really struggling to find the motivation to believe in the gospel, and they wanted to, but they weren't in a place where their heart was so inclined. They weren't leaning into it. They felt every day that they woke up like there was just an edge, a haunting of doubt behind every question they ask. If you had just less than 5 minutes to encourage that person and give them a little bit of hope, what would you say to help them work through that season of doubt?
Well, I think that this is a great question. It's a great question and very important. If I had time, I want to get to know them and just get a
Yeah.
sense of what the issues are, and I want to encourage them. But here's what I think I would say. First of all, I'd want to say, look, we've all been there. I mean, in one sense, I became an apologist because I had my own doubts. I thought I got to find answers to these questions, and I found them. The answers are there. And I was then able to use these to speak to others who doubt, and more importantly, to speak beyond the church to a wider culture and say, here is why Christianity actually is so wonderful. So, doubt might be about a growing pain in faith, or it might be about, you haven't yet fully discovered its richness. Maybe there's an invitation to explore your faith more fully, perhaps in conversation with others. But here's a point I'd want to make to anybody going through a time of doubt. Have you ever thought that many atheists do exactly the same? They begin to realize, hey, we can't prove our atheism. We have to trust it's right. And Richard Dawkins had that experience when debating with Rowan Williams, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury at Oxford back in 2012. He just suddenly realized, I can't prove that there is no God. It's a faith. And, so atheists doubt things as well. It's really important to realize that doubt is not limited to Christians. If you are an atheist who believes there is no God, you cannot prove that, and you don't know you're right, and you're going to have doubts. So see the bigger picture here. But I think that the main thing I want to say, and I hope this is appropriate, I hope it will be helpful, is to say that one of the things I found really helpful to think about is this. Here am I, I'm just an ordinary human being. I've got a limited intelligence. How on earth can I make complete sense of everything? I can't. There are things that I can't really fully understand. But I trust. I trust in a God who loves me. I trust in a God who redeems me. And even if I can't get my head around everything, I can still see there's something there, something wonderful that excites and transforms. And hey, even I'm able to try and help other people grasp this and come to faith. So I want to say all these things, but hey, it would take longer than just a few minutes. So I'm sorry about that.
No, Dr. McGrath, this has been wonderful and exciting, and I'm sure many of the people attending the conference will be ready when they come to hear what you have to say. And this last little bit made me think of C.S. Lewis a little bit, where he says that he believes in Christianity kind of like he believes in the sun, not just that he can see it, but that by it he sees everything else. And that in that there's this excitement and energy as he's being able to look around the world and see reasons for hope and joy. And I hope that those attending our conference get that ethos and that energy that you're bringing, and it fuels them and the importance of their work in local church ministry and how they are able to shepherd and love their congregations well. So thank you for joining us for this video, and I look forward to more involvement here in the conference.
And I look forward enormously to being with you, to be able to speak to you and to encourage you. And yes, I will be talking about C.S. Lewis because he's great.
Yes, you've written a little bit about him. Well, thank you, Dr. McGrath.
My pleasure. Thank you.